Hello everyone, I'm Inverse, and on today's episode of StratTalk, we are going to be taking a look at a couple of very slightly different Ostheer builds. And I decided to structure this episode this way, showing, in this case, 3 different games with 3 slightly different strategies. For 2 reasons. First of all, I wanted to give you guys a few more ideas for different Ostheer strategies to try out. And secondly, I wanted to give you guys a bit of insight into how I evolve and modify strategies game to game based on what I see and what I experience in games. And hopefully that will give you guys a bit more insight into how I come up with the stuff I come up with, and hopefully let you guys do a bit of that work on your own so you can come up with some stuff by yourself. So let's jump in this game right now. This is a game against CCArt SO3, who is a old-time vanilla Company of Heroes player. And the goal of mine when I went into this game and beforehand thinking about what I would do this game was I wanted something, because as you all know, the previous StratTalk episode I recorded was, in a sense, a personal challenge for me. I wanted to try and see, first of all, because people had been talking so much about how infantry-centric strategies seem impossible to do in Company of Heroes 2, first of all, and second of all, because of the recent nerfs to Ostheer Tier 3. I wanted to try my best to come up with some sort of strategy that relied as little on teching as possible, and we saw in the last episode how that style of play could go well, and then conversely how that style of play could perhaps go poorly, and some of the weaknesses inherent in that style of play. What I tried to go into this game trying to figure out was, how can I make a completely standard, completely stable Ostheer build order that gives me as many options to win as possible and relies as little as possible on what my opponent does and how my opponent reacts. And how I usually go about developing builds like this is I start with the greediest build I can possibly come up with, and then I gradually narrow it down and make concessions based on what I see my opponent do. So what I wanted to do, my goal was, for this game at least, I want to try to get to Tier 3 as quickly as I possibly can, because with the way upkeep and manpower income works right now, it's not very efficient and not very intelligent to stick on lower tiers for too long, because you end up with your manpower and your population locked into low efficiency units that end up costing you a lot in the long term, because you have to reinforce a lot of infantry, and when you're reinforcing a lot of infantry, you're of course spending a lot of manpower. You don't necessarily have a lot of manpower because you have a lot of population locked into infantry squads that are then having to be constantly reinforced. So I wanted something that took more advantage of higher Ostheer tech tiers, while at the same time giving me an opportunity to excel in the early game and react to whatever my opponent could possibly throw at me. So this first game was more a feeler for, hey, I know my opponent's pretty good, I know what I want to do, and I know there's a bunch of things he could do, both things that I'm prepared for and things that I might not even be thinking of, that he could possibly do in reaction to what I want to be doing. What is my opponent going to show me, and am I going to be able to handle it or not? That's the main thing I wanted to try and figure out. Is there's a lot of things my opponent could possibly do. Is he going to show me something that is just going to be nearly impossible for me to beat, or extremely difficult for me to overcome? Or am I going to be able to show that, hey, this style of thinking, this angle is actually going to be potentially successful? So going on to the build I decided to start off trying, it's very similar to the Tier 2 build, at least in Tier 1. It's very similar in that sense to the build I showed in the previous StratTalk episode. I wanted to extend my Tier 1 as much as possible for 2 reasons. First of all, I wanted to control as much of the map as I possibly could, because if I'm going straight tier 3, I need to be getting a lot of fuel really quickly, because if I don't have a lot of fuel really quickly, I'm going to be stuck in the middle of my tech tiers where I might have my tier 3 upgrade coming, but by the time my tier 3 building comes up, I might not actually have the fuel to exploit that building, and that's kind of a problematic situation, because in that sense, I've spent a whole whack of resources on just teching up without getting any return for that investment. And if I can't then get some return for my investment, which requires me spending more money and mainly more fuel because of the increase in the Stug cost and of course the very high Ostwind fuel cost, I have to have a lot of territory. I also need to be able to defend against flanks in the early game, and I need to be able to defend against any quick tech that my opponent might show me, in many cases that being scout cars. So in order to combat that, I have 3 Grand Squads, I also have 2 MGs, and I'm teching a bit more slowly after that. You'll notice right now my fuel isn't in very good condition. I haven't really been able to secure the map control that I've wanted to secure in this early game, and though I do have a decent amount of the map in my possession, and you'll notice up here I'm harassing my opponent's fuel, that's good, but my opponent has had that fuel connected for a fairly long time. Me, on the other hand, have had this fuel point disconnected constantly, and it shows in my fuel income right now. It's going to be very difficult for me to actually tech to tier 3 effectively with a very low fuel income, and a very low fuel income for so long. I haven't had fuel for very long, even though I do have it now. You'll notice I actually do have a decent fuel income, 17, which is respectable, not excellent, but respectable. I haven't had it for as long as I would like to have it, which is a problem. Now you'll notice my opponent's gone Molotovs, which is a relatively aggressive early game tech. This is something I need to be able to deal with effectively with my strategy. If my strategy is something that can't deal effectively with this kind of aggression and still follow up and tech properly, then it's something that I'm going to have to modify or change eventually. You'll notice if you played Vanilla Company of Heroes, the theory behind what I'm doing is very similar to the theory behind a straight fast tier 3 tech in Vanilla Company of Heroes. You extend your tier 1 so that you can get as much map control as possible while defending against any aggression and then teching as quickly as possible. Now, one big problem is just the general map geometry. The fact that there are a lot of buildings around, which Molotovs are very effective with, and which small arms fire is extremely ineffective against, makes stalling for me with this strategy a bit more difficult. You'll notice I've once again lost my fuel, and I'm still trying to tech up to tier 3. You'll notice I have my tier 3 upgrade coming, but look at my fuel right now. I've got 33 fuel, I've got a 10 fuel income. I'm in a position to perhaps harass maybe a little bit, but I've just lost an MG. My opponents recruited that MG, and I really don't have any aggressive potential anymore. I've lost a Pioneer squad, which I started with 3 for, mainly because I wanted to be able to cap as much of the territory as possible, and I also wanted to experiment with sending that first engineer squad up here. However, if we look at the map control, I'm in a little bit of trouble. There's really not much I can do from here. I'm locked into my tier 3 tech. If I tech now to tier 2, I'm just going to be way too far behind at this point, because I've already invested in the tier 3 upgrade. I've invested fairly heavily in an extended tier 1, which doesn't bode well for my chances of getting any tier 2 units up and with any degree of quickness. I need relatively quick tier 2 units if I'm going to be going for tier 2, and I just don't have the ability to do that with the strategy that I have right now. So I'm pinned back in my base. I don't really have anything I can do. I do have healing, but I'm fighting a losing battle at this point. My opponent has fairly effective suppression. He's got a lot of the map. He has freedom to do pretty much anything he wants at this point in the game with his teching. He could go tier 3 if he wants. He could just go tier 1 and tier 2. Maybe he'll go tier 4 even. It's hard to say exactly what he would do, but his options are far greater than mine, and he has a lot more freedom to decide than I do. I'm trying to get my territory back. I've lost Grenadier squads, and that's going to be game right there. So what we saw here was me trying the most absolutely greediest thing I could do and seeing what my opponent could do to punish it. As we saw here, very aggressive conscript play was something that allowed me to get punished fairly easily by a strategy such as this, or with a strategy such as this. So what we'll see in the next game is how I've made some concessions to this in order to make my build a little bit safer, a little bit weaker perhaps too in the early game, but safer in the mid and later on, so that I can actually transition and play out a longer game without having to rely on, hey, I really hope my opponent isn't aggressive, or I really hope I get lucky and I can stop him. So we'll jump into game number 2 and I'll show you guys what I'm talking about. Alright guys, welcome back. This is game number 2. This is actually a game on the same map, same starting positions, and against the same opponent. This is against CCR at SO3 once again, and this was actually played immediately after that previous game. So this is a very straight up, I just played this guy, he just beat me, what can I do to make it so that, hey, maybe I can win this game. So immediately a big change you'll see is this far earlier tier 1 building. I built the tier 1 building this time with my first Pioneer squad. I got a single extra Pioneer squad, and I'm not sending that first Pioneer squad out to this house. This was an idea I got from watching some recent 1v1s in Ip Kai Feng's beta tournament, and it's extremely effective in some situations because it's so difficult to remove units from buildings in the beta right now. It's extremely difficult without flamers or molotovs or mortars or any type of explicitly building clearing unit to actually clear buildings in the early game. Even grenadier rifle grenades for the Ostheer doesn't really do a very good job. So that was something I wanted to try and exploit. You'll notice it actually did do a decent job of forcing my opponent's attention, and it allowed me to get a decent amount of map control, but it came at the expense of delaying my tier 1 because I had an extra Pioneer squad that cost me an extra 200 manpower, and therefore delayed my first Grenadier squad by 200 manpower. Now you'll notice I've modified my capping order a little bit as well. I'm sending this first Pioneer squad straight down to this bottom. This is because, as we saw in the previous game, I had a lot of trouble getting fuel up consistently and early. I need fuel, of course, for any sort of tier 3 tech, and I need that fuel as early as possible, because if I delay that fuel too long, it's going to be far too difficult for me to actually push back and have the fuel I need in the timing I need to be effective and actually get the teching done that I want to get done. Another concession I'll be making is to the length of my tier 1. You'll notice I'll be getting an MG right now straight after 2 Grenadiers. Now this is the same as what I did in my previous match. Of course, my previous match had me with 3 Pioneers, so this is of course a slightly earlier first MG, which will therefore be a slightly earlier second MG, but the big difference is going to come with what I do after this fact. I'll be getting a second MG, I don't believe it started yet, no, but I'll be getting a second MG, then I'll be getting my healing, and then I will be beginning my tech, in this instance to tier 2 rather than tier 3. And this is something that makes me feel a little bit more comfortable about what I want to be doing and what I need to be doing. I found, at least looking at my last game, I thought really hard watching the replay of that last game and going over it and asking myself, what went wrong? What was weak? What could have been stronger? And how can I increase the strength of my early game while at the same time not jeopardizing my tech to tier 3 straight away? Because the way manpower income and stuff like that works in Company of Heroes 2 right now, it's a very confusing and convoluted strategic process that you have to go through when actually trying to come up with, hey, what should I be doing in a situation like this? Because a lot of the time in vanilla Company of Heroes, you could make a trade-off between investing a lot in the early game in infantry units, in which case you will be a little bit behind in terms of manpower for a few reasons. First of all, you're spending a lot of manpower early on less cost-effective units. You're spending a lot of manpower early on infantry that dies fairly easily, and a lot of infantry, so you're spending a little bit more on upkeep. But you can capitalize on that by capping a bit more territory, because every strategic point in Company of Heroes, in vanilla Company of Heroes, gave you a little bit of manpower income. So your manpower income was also a function of your map control, so you could take advantage of investing a bit more in the early game on infantry, which would give you a bit more map control, and at the same time offset your lack of manpower income a little bit as well. Now you'll notice my opponent's gone for a slightly different early game. He went for a tier 1 fairly quickly, neglecting his conscript upgrades in favor of scout cars and that one sniper who met an unfortunate and untimely demise. But I did lose a grenadier squad up here, so we're relatively even at this point in terms of manpower. I have the slight advantage. I also have the slight advantage in terms of map control, which is something that I wanted in general, and is something that of course I can't necessarily rely on a lot with this strategy, because we notice I did reduce the length of my tier 1. I went instead for 4 tier 1 units rather than the 5 tier 1 units that I showed in my previous game. And I also delayed my healing until after my tier 2 building. You'll notice I have a tier 2 building now up around the 6-minute mark. I'm getting my first Panzer Grenadier out. And in other games, in general conscript aggression games, this would give me a strong base to counter any sort of early aggression, and also give me a relatively powerful infantry base to advance into the mid game and maintain territory rather than simply capturing it and then falling into a situation like we kind of saw in my previous video, where there's this weakened mid game where my opponent has this nice swell of units, nice swell of upgrades, and I have nothing to really effectively counteract it. That's something I want to try and avoid as much as possible, because it's a situation like that that puts too much of the control of the game in my opponent's hands. I don't want to have to be relying on, I really hope my opponent doesn't do this thing, or I really hope my opponent does this thing and not this other thing. I want it to be more predicated on, hey, if I play this properly, I put myself in at least this minimum of position where I can maybe tech a little bit this way, I can maybe tech a little bit that way, but I'm never excuse me, but I'm never in a situation where I'm just instantly not able to do anything else. Now you notice I was able to take out that scout car right there, and that's a big blow to my opponent, that coupled with my map control. We're actually not going to see the tier 3 transition in this game, but we are going to see me attempting to set it up and at least put myself in a favorable situation and feel out how many, say, tier 2 units, how much tier 2 construction I actually have to commit to before I can safely tech to tier 3. Because that's something also that's fairly different between Company of Heroes 2 and Vanilla Company of Heroes. In Vanilla Company of Heroes, it was a fairly obvious, hey, you needed probably 3 tier 2 units before you tech to tier 3 off of tier 2. And that would give you solid defense against vehicles, while at the same time giving you a decent enough anti-tank establishment to actually do the damage you want to be able to do, and maintain the map that you need to be able to maintain in order to support your tech. And I found in Company of Heroes 2, it's relatively the same. I've been going with the same philosophy and getting a couple of Panzer Grenadiers followed by a pack as a means generally of just playing it safe, because it's fairly difficult now to actually predict when your opponent is going to be teching and when your opponent is going to be producing units, just because most players don't have their timings worked out. Most players don't really have a good feel for the speed of tech in Company of Heroes 2. It feels fairly quick to a lot of people, but at the same time it really isn't all that quick. You just kind of have to change your mental definition of what the early game is, and accept that there's going to be some slightly heavier vehicles in that early game, but that it's still going to exist in a manner that's relatively similar to what you've experienced in the past. Now, as we can see right here, I do have most of the map. I'm getting I will be getting my healing, I think, right now. Will I? Yes, I'm getting my healing right now. And I have all of the map I need at this point. I'm capping this middle while at the same time dealing a lot of damage. I'm actually probably going to kill that conscript squad. My opponent has lost a lot of infantry and is in a lot of trouble at this point in the game, and is actually going to call a GG right there. But that's a slight modification. You'll notice it was against the same opponent. It was against a slightly modified build on my opponent's part, but you saw it was slightly more easy to manage going into the mid game. I got slightly quicker tech, and though it wasn't the tech that I wanted explicitly, I didn't overinvest in the early game in my tier 1 units. Instead, I decided to get my tier 2 units up a little bit quicker and use those units, being slightly more cost effective even though they are slightly more expensive, to give myself a decent platform to extend into tier 3 and to eventually, as we'll see in the next game, work in some tier 3 units. So let's jump into that one, and I'll see you guys in a second. Alrighty guys, welcome to game number 3. This is going to be a game against Marines Reborn on Pripyat. So we're going to have a slightly different map, and therefore a slightly different style of play from both sides. But we'll see a further slight evolution of the strategy in this situation, and how I've decided to modify it both for the map and eventually for the situations that the game presents. Now, the first thing you'll notice is this first Pioneer squad did not build the tier 1 building straight away. This is a game that takes place after the previous 2 games, so this isn't me experimenting. This is me trying something that's very much map dependent. If you'll notice this big choke point right here, I guess it's not a big choke point, it's actually a rather small choke point, but this choke point right here is a pivotal movement area for Ostheer troops, or for rather Soviet troops in the early game. What I've been trying with a fairly decent degree of success in the early game is sending my very first Pioneer squad straight up to lay wire at this point. Now this does a couple of things, mainly because of how wire works in the beta right now. First of all, if my opponent wants to cut it, he has to sacrifice a flamer squad. He has to get a minesweeper squad, because those are the squads that are actually able to cut wire. And that means, first of all, he's spending munitions on a upgrade that isn't flamethrowers, which is great for me because flamethrowers are so incredibly powerful right now. Second of all, he's of course spending munitions that he can't spend on other upgrades, that he can't spend on Molotovs, at least not as many Molotovs, AT grenades, so on and so forth. And also, because vehicles don't actually crush wire, they phase through it right now, which is actually a weird, it's been called a design decision by some on the Relic dev team, and it's actually a strange design decision in my opinion. But it makes wire in the early game extremely powerful, because scout cars, vehicles that can actually pass through the wire, will not destroy it, and therefore can't destroy the wire for infantry squads to pass through. So what this wire does is it essentially forces my opponent to limit his attacks to this area, down on this bottom side, which you'll see my opponent at right now, seeing as he's capped that point, and also up here on this top side, which gives me a bit of freedom to neglect on defense of this middle area, knowing chances are my opponent is not going to be spending a lot of time and effort trying to cap this middle area, simply because it's going to cost him a lot of munitions, it's going to cost him a flamer, most likely. This is especially important because in fact most Soviet players right now are only getting a single engineer squad in the early game. Because you can build conscripts from your HQ building, most Soviet players have just been straight starting on conscripts, which gives you a nice early game combat advantage, because generally an Ostheer player is going to be building a second Pioneer, and sometimes in this situation you see 3 Pioneer squads in the early game. So it gives the Soviet player the advantage of having a stronger combat force, but the disadvantage of only having a single engineer squad to upgrade. and if he's going to choose to get a Minesweeper squad, well, that means I don't have to worry about flamethrowers at all, which is excellent for me and excellent for any Ostheer player, because flamethrowers are really, really powerful, very, very difficult, and difficult to focus fire as well because of the lack of damage that rifles actually do. So that's the thought behind this very simple piece of wire, and it's a fairly effective means of delaying your opponent in the early game and later on into the mid game. Now you'll notice I'm going for the same tier 1 build, minus of course that extra Pioneer as I did in the previous game, and on a map like this, an extended tier 1 is a bit more effective simply because you have a lot more map and a lot more territory to actually worry about. You have to defend a lot more, you have to be attacking a lot more, you have to be in a lot more places at once if you want to harass your opponent while at the same time maintaining the map control that you currently have. You'll notice my opponent is actually heading up here, and he's going to be trying to harass my fuel point, while I at the same time am trying to harass his fuel point down here at the bottom. We do see a scout car fairly quickly, so we do know my opponent has gone tier 1 and probably hasn't built all that many conscripts, which isn't necessarily a big tell one way or the other, but it is an interesting thing to note. Excuse me. It is an interesting thing to note. Now that we see the second scout car, we have to start to think about how we can counter this, how we can react to what my opponent is doing. This is something I didn't see in either of the previous games. In my first game, we saw aggressive conscript play, and we saw how an extended tier 1 could have some troubles with that if you didn't follow it up straight away with tier 2. In the second game, we saw a fairly quick single scout car with relatively aggressive conscript play. Not nearly as aggressive as in the first game, of course, but far more aggressive than Marines is executing right now by getting these 2 scout cars, which brings us, of course, to our third style of play, which is this very aggressive 2 scout car play. This is kind of the polar opposite to what my tier 1, tier 2 strategy in my previous StratTalk aimed to do. In Marine's case, he's trying to be super cost effective. We'll actually see him get a couple of snipers afterwards and try to deal as much damage as possible while taking as little damage in terms of manpower as possible, which is a very smart way to play, again, because of how upkeep and manpower income works right now in Company of Heroes 2. You are spending very little in terms of manpower and in terms of pop cap, which means your manpower income is fairly high, but you're getting a lot of effectiveness out of your units because you're not really reinforcing your snipers. Sure, you might have to reinforce them once in a while. It's a single man. If you keep them alive, they're going to deal a lot more damage than they cost you in reinforcements. You have scout cars, which of course are repaired for nearly free. I'm actually not sure how repairing works in Company of Heroes 2. I know in vanilla Company of Heroes you did pay a slight cost to your manpower income by repairing. I'm not sure if that is the case in Company of Heroes 2, but regardless, it is essentially free damage for the Soviet player, and that's of course very intelligent. Now, how I've managed, or how I've decided I want to counteract this, is I got a fairly quick healing bunker. You'll notice this is different from my previous game, where I got a slightly later healing bunker and had a lot of trouble with my opponent's flamethrowers and stuff like that. You'll notice I got that bunker up before I even got my tier 2 building up. I'm going to be getting my tier 2 building up fairly shortly afterwards. I just got my tier 2 upgrade now, and in the meantime I'm trying as best as possible to use my grenadiers to counter these scout cars. One big problem right now with early vehicles is the fact that infantry weapons tend to not really penetrate. It's a very annoying phenomenon in Company of Heroes 2, but in vanilla Company of Heroes, if you had a half-track or a light vehicle down this low, you could almost always kill it with small arms fire rather than having to spend another Panzerfaust or having to spend a bit more munitions on killing that vehicle ultimately. In Company of Heroes 2, vehicles seem far more resistant to small arms fire, and especially at the end when you're trying to get a killing critical on an infantry squad, it seems relatively difficult to actually kill with at least grenadier and, in the Soviet case, conscript fire light vehicles without using AT grenades or without using Panzerfausts. MGs, however, do an excellent job. Now, if we look back at my base, I have my tier 2 building up. I'm actually going to attempt to kill this scout car and actually succeed thanks to the vision afforded to me by this flamer squad. I also did lose an MG a little bit earlier. That was one very important lesson that I hadn't quite learned yet, but which I learned, of course, in this game. You'll notice this attack in vanilla Company of Heroes, straight on attacks by half-track like vehicles generally don't deal as much damage as those scout cars did. Those scout cars killed ridiculously quickly this MG squad just from straight on, and that's something that I've stashed away. Excuse me, I've stashed away now to know, hey, if my opponent's running at an MG with a couple scout cars, probably a good idea to get that scout car out of there. But anyways, I have my first Panzer Grenadier out right now. I have a decent amount of the map. I've managed to kill one of my opponent's scout cars. I've recovered my opponent's second scout car, and now I have an abundance of infantry relative to my opponent because my opponent spent a lot early game on teching. First of all, he built the tier 1 building, which of course for a Soviet player is a relatively steep investment in the early game because generally you're expecting Soviet players to invest a lot in conscripts. And if your Soviet opponent is not investing a lot in conscripts, it gives you a lot more freedom around the map. You can move around the map a lot easier, you can cap around the map a lot easier, stuff like that. And my opponent, of course, also invested a lot in building these 2 scout cars. And with one scout car dead and the other scout car in my possession, I've exponentially increased the strength of my force relative to my opponent, and I've given myself a lot of aggressive potential at this point in the game right now, because my opponent is either rebuilding his units on his current tech, in which case I have equal tech and more units, so I'm going to win an engagement that way, or my opponent's teching up, in which case I have equal tech but far more units, far more even than what my opponent had, than what I would have if my opponent was simply building units. So you'll notice my opponent coming down here on the bottom trying to secure his map control also has a shock troop squad up here in the middle. So this is kind of a tip-off that my opponent probably isn't investing all that heavily in, or is rather probably investing fairly heavily in his current tech, and instead of teching up is instead deciding, hey, I probably need to invest more heavily in the tier I have because I need unit count at this point. If he doesn't get unit count, it's very easy for me to run him off the map, which is a smart move of his. And the way I've chosen to counter it currently is to simply continue along the path that I outlined in my previous game, where I'm probably going to get 3 tier 2 units, and then I'm going to start teching up as quickly as I can. You'll notice I got a single Panzer Grenadier. I decided this game to get a pack second, and the prime reason for this, there's actually 2 reasons. First of all, my opponent has had this fuel for almost the entire game, and though excuse me, and though it seems highly unlikely with what my opponent has invested in, the fact that he lost a conscript squad in the early game, he lost both of these scout cars, and though I also lost a Gren squad in the early game, he's lost far more than I have, and chances are he's not going to be teching up. But in a game as young as Company of Heroes 2, when it can be so difficult to judge what your opponent is doing and predict your opponent's tech and figure out what your opponent has decided to do, in a situation like this where I'm already ahead, I already have the advantage, I have unit count, I'm fairly equal on tech, and I will eventually have the tech advantage as well. It's something I like to do just to play a little bit more safe, to give up a little bit of that advantage, knowing I'm still going to be ahead, but if my opponent manages to surprise me with something that I might not expect, like if he rolls out with a T-34, when I just didn't seem like I'd be able, or that like he'd be able to get a T-34, but hey, he got a T-34. Now I don't have anything to deal with it. As opposed to, hey, maybe I built a pack and my opponent built another shock troop squad. So I have a unit that might not be useful against his infantry. He has an extra unit that's very effective against my infantry. So he's narrowed the gap that was created by him losing those scout cars. However, the gap that existed is at the very least equalized, and in the best situation for me, still very much in existence for me. So I'm going to be trying at least to press this advantage by playing as aggressively as possible from this point on right now. I have a lot of map control. I have the security of 2 victory points here and here, and I chances are have the unit advantage, even though he may have been able to equalize slightly. The fact that I was able to steal his scout car and have infantry squads that are at least as strong as his most powerful infantry squads. I have shock troopers, or I have panzer grenadiers, which are at least as powerful as his shock troopers, and definitely more powerful than conscripts without the submachine gun upgrade. I'm also going to actually kill a sniper right there, which is a very big victory for me. But as you'll see, it's very easy for me at this point in the game to run over my opponent's position on the left-hand side, mainly because of that resource advantage and that unit advantage, thanks to that early game and thanks to me being able to kill those scout cars. Now I am eventually, around now, going to be teching up. You'll notice I actually cut short my tier 2 production for a couple of reasons. First of all, I have so much of the map, I have so much fuel at this point, and I have a decent amount of manpower. My manpower income is also being slightly reduced. I am going to get a second Panzer Grenadier squad out, just because I'm fairly certain now that my opponent is probably excuse me, I apologize for the coughing. I'm fairly certain now that my opponent is probably not going to be going for any sort of tier 3 tech. And even if he is going to go for tier 3 tech, I've stolen an AT gun. I have 2 AT guns right now. I have a couple Panzer Streks. Actually, did I cancel that second? I did cancel. Okay, so never mind. I completely forgot that I canceled that. So I canceled my second Panzer Grenadier squad, and I'm still getting my tier 3 upgrade. And this is primarily because there's not really any point in me continuing to invest. This is one of those kind of give and take relationships that I'm still trying to work out in Company of Heroes 2, because in vanilla Company of Heroes there was very little long-term detriment to building another Grenadier squad. It was more a short-term, you are going to delay your veterancy, or you're going to delay your next tier building slightly. Upkeep for the Ostheer, or for the Wehrmacht faction in vanilla Company of Heroes, was negligible, and as I've mentioned before, gaining map control of course also gave you slight bonuses to manpower income as well. So there wasn't really any long-term effects negatively to, say, building an extra Grenadier squad. It might slow some stuff down, but you weren't going to negatively impact, say, your manpower income, which is the case in Company of Heroes 2. You'll notice I'm down to a meager 175 manpower per minute. If I had built that second Panzer Grenadier squad, I would probably be even lower than that, and it would be even more difficult to get my tech up. You'll notice I've actually been able to get my tier 3 building up fairly easily, but it's going to take me around 2 more minutes, perhaps a minute and a half, for me to actually get the manpower necessary to tech to Ostwinds. And in a game like this, it's not really too big of a deal. I already have a supreme advantage. I've cut my opponent off. I've stolen a scout car. I've killed scout cars. I've killed a sniper and a conscript squad. So in this situation, it's not too big of a deal. But in a closer game, it can be a slight issue. Overinvesting, as we saw in my previous video, in tier 2 units, which then doesn't really give you the flexibility to then tech up later and get more cost-effective units that can counter your opponent's more cost-effective units, while at the same time not dying in the mid-game. So it's a very interesting dynamic that wasn't present in vanilla Company of Heroes, and I'm not sure if it's necessarily better or worse. It's far too early to tell right now. It's definitely different, and it definitely requires a different approach. And it's exciting right now because it's hard to say what is correct and what is not. It's hard to say hey, should I be even building this many units? This is a lot of infantry units. This is a lot of early game units. People are going to come up with situations much like they did in the later days of vanilla Company of Heroes, where players have been able to drastically reduce as much as humanly possible the amount of investment they make in lower tiers in order to maximize the effectiveness of higher tier units and get those higher tier units out as quickly as possible. We're not quite there yet with Company of Heroes 2, and stack on top of that fact the fact that stuff's changing. We don't know if, for example, this upkeep system is going to be the upkeep system in the final game. So there's a lot of unknowns, and for that reason I don't encourage you to delve too deeply just yet into situations such as how can I best optimize builds for manpower income and upkeep and stuff like that. But it's something interesting to keep in mind because it forces you to think differently about how the game is played and how you should be organizing your builds and how you should be organizing your units and what you should be building in certain situations and so on and so forth. Now you'll notice I haven't actually talked very much about doctrine choice in either of my Ostheer videos. I find personally that I'm not a guy who likes tier 4 in Company of Heroes 2. It's very expensive, it takes a long time to get to, it's primarily anti-tank, and I feel that with the tanks that the Soviet players are feeling right now, the biggest threat is the T-34, and I don't feel you need a Panther to effectively deal with that T-34. I feel like you can do it perfectly fine with Grenadiers and packs, and if you need Panzer Grenadiers with Panzerschrecks, I feel that's more than enough to deal effectively with any sort of Soviet armor that can really pose a serious threat. So I don't see much use in 1v1s to actually be teching to tier 4 consistently. It definitely has its situational uses, but I just don't find it very consistently useful as a tech, and for that reason I haven't really been basing my doctrine choices on late game, because a lot of the late game doctrine choices, primarily of course the Tiger, rely on you having that tier 4 building out in order to get the Tiger actually built, and that's not something I've ever felt the need to build. So I've primarily been going for, I believe it's the Jaeger infantry doctrine, which gives G43s and infantry camouflage. I've really only been using the G43s and on occasion, like you saw right there, the artillery for dealing with AT guns. And I found doctrine far less so even than the Soviets, where I don't think it's very impactful either. Not impactful, that's not actually a word. It doesn't hold very much significance for Soviets. I don't believe it either holds very much significance for Ostheer. So that's why I haven't really been talking much in my videos about doctrine choice. Choose whatever you like. I've personally enjoyed the G43 upgrades for my Grenadiers, and that's pretty much the only reason I've been getting the Jaeger infantry doctrine. If you're someone who likes perhaps instead of teching to tier 3, teching to tier 4, which is going to take you a little bit longer and leave you a bit more open to strong infantry play, because you're not going to have as much anti-infantry to fall back on. Meanwhile, with the tier 2, tier 3 strategy, we've negated the cost increase on the Stug by relying on our tier 2 units for our AT and giving us mobile anti-infantry strength in the form of Ostwinds, Panzer IVs, stuff like that, out of our tier 3 building. So I hope that was informative for you guys. It was fun for me trying to come up with a way to play a bit more of a standard game, and this is by no means the final product, but this is something that I'm very confident will be effective later on, and with some minor tweaks could definitely be something that you can play in almost all situations and modify according to what you see in the game. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Of course, any questions, comments, stuff like that, please do post them below. It was announced today that the beta will be ending on the 30th of April. I believe we will, on the 28th of April, not be able to cast any more Company of Heroes 2 replays, but I will be doing my best to post as much content over the next week or so as possible. So check back here for some more stuff, and I'll see you guys next time.